Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I want to just express again that we are in a very difficult time for our nation. We believe very strongly that this has been a national crisis. We've seen the impacts on the residents of Ottawa, on small businesses, on people, and we've seen an attack on our democracy. We've seen the impact to workers who've faced lost hours of lost days of wages. And we've seen a serious attack on our democracy by a group that was set on undermining the democratically elected system. And so given the serious crisis, what we've expressed from the beginning, we should have never got to this point. We should have never got here. And it is a failure of leadership, both federal, provincial, and in fact, municipal as well, that to take this threat seriously, that brought us to this moment. And so in response to that failure of leadership to take this seriously, we believe now the measures put in place are taking this threat seriously and are helping to address the serious crisis. Our support from the beginning has always been reluctant. We're reluctant because it should have never got to this point. So we are reluctantly prepared to support the Emergencies Measures Act to protect our democracy, to protect workers, and to particularly target the financing of this very serious convoy, the occupation that has put a serious threat to Canadians, to the residents of Ottawa, and to our democracy. And for those reasons, we're prepared to support reluctantly. But I also want to be clear. We are prepared, and we've advised the Prime Minister that we are prepared to pull our support and to trigger a vote on the Emergencies Measures Act as soon as we believe it is no longer necessary. And we're calling on the government and the Prime Minister to provide transparent, up-to-date information regarding its necessity. And as soon as that changes, as soon as it's no longer necessary, we are prepared to pull our support. We believe that the public inquiry that will follow has to address some serious problems here. Serious problems with policing that allowed many police to not enforce laws, to allow lawlessness to occur, and deeply concerning trends around the fact that there was not just sympathy, but there were members of the military and the police that facilitated some of these occupiers. That is something that's deeply troubling. We also want to be very clear that the application of the Emergencies Measures Act in this case should not at all be seen as a precedent. This is an unprecedented situation with a group that was targeting with the goal of undermining democracy. That was their goal. And in that light, this should not apply to community members that are raising their voice in legal protests, Indigenous community members fighting for their rights, environmental activists, workers that are fighting for fair collective deals. This should not apply to Canadians that use their voice to legally and peacefully protest and raise their grievances. That is something that should be protected and should continue to moving forward. Donc aujourd'hui, je veux dire que on reconnaît comme parti, comme des néo-démocrates qu'on était, et on est toujours dans une crise nationale, qu'il y a des gens qui veulent retourner à Ottawa et qui attendent que les mesures d'urgence arrêtent et ils vont retourner tout de suite. Donc, on est toujours dans une crise et notre appui depuis le début de cette crise était réticent et notre appui continue d'être réticent parce que on pense qu'on n'aurait dû jamais être dans cette situation et que c'était l'échec du gouvernement fédéral, provincial et municipal qui nous a rendu dans cette situation. Parce que les niveaux de gouvernement n'ont pas pris au sérieux la menace de ce convoi et de l'occupation. Donc, c'est encore avec on prend au sérieux la gravité de cette situation. Notre appui pour cette vote est avec réticence et on va continuer de dire ce que j'ai dit. J'ai avisé le gouvernement, j'ai avisé le Premier ministre que notre appui ne va pas continuer pour la longue durée, pour 30 jours, qu'on est prêt d'enlever notre appui. C'est jamais le cas, qu'on ne pense pas que c'est nécessaire de continuer d'appuyer ces mesures. Donc, notre appui n'est pas là pour tous les 30 jours. On est prêt d'enlever notre appui. Et on veut dire aussi clairement que ce cas est sans précédent. C'était un groupe qui veut attaquer notre démocratie, qui veut renverser les élus. Donc, ce n'est pas un cas de précédent et ce ne doit pas être appliqué sur les Canadiens, Canadiennes ou les Québécois, Québécoises qui veulent manifester dans une manière de paix légale. C'est toujours le droit des gens de se manifester et ils doivent avoir ce droit. Donc, on ne doit pas appliquer ces mesures sur les Canadiens comme les communautés autochtones ou les environnementalistes ou les communautés racisées ou n'importe qui est dans notre pays qui veut se manifester dans une manière légale, dans une manière de paix. C'est toujours le droit et ça doit continuer d'être leur droit. Finalement, je veux aussi reconnaître que dans ce moment de crise, on va montrer de leadership pour comment régler cette crise. Et encore, on exige tous les partis de reconnaître la gravité de cette situation et de ne pas essayer de gagner des points politiques, mais de montrer de leadership aussi pour régler cette crise. Merci. Thank you. With that, I'm ready for any questions you might have.
Merci, Jagmeet. On va passer aux questions. Un petit rappel d'utiliser la fonction « Lever la main ». Vous allez avoir une question puis un suivi. Well, thank you. We are now ready for questions. Reminder to use the raise your hand function. You will have a question and a follow-up. Première question, Christian Noël de Radio-Canada.
Bonjour, M. Singh. Vous dites, ni plus ni moins, vous ne voulez pas donner un chèque en blanc aux libéraux. N'empêche, les mesures s'appliquent maintenant. Vous dites que vous êtes prête à retirer votre appui. Quelles sont vos conditions pour retirer l'appui et comment allez-vous le savoir? Donc,
on a quelques mécanismes qui va être mis en œuvre tout de suite. Un, c'est un comité qui est formé par des députés. Donc, le travail de ce comité, c'est d'analyser la situation. Donc, si jamais le cas, le comité peut montrer qu'on n'a pas besoin des mesures. Ça, c'est un outil et c'est une façon avec laquelle on peut vérifier que oui, ce n'est pas nécessaire de continuer l'appui. Deuxièmement, on va avoir des rencontres. Le Premier ministre va aviser la situation avec la transparence et on va évaluer ce qu'il dit pour encore vérifier si les mesures sont toujours nécessaires. Donc, on va vérifier avec le comité et aussi avec l'information que le gouvernement nous donne et on va prendre une décision. Mais je peux encore vérifier ou je peux encore répéter que dans notre avis, ce n'est pas, dans ce cas, ce n'est pas nécessaire d'avoir ces pouvoirs pour toute la longue durée de 30 journées et on va garder notre droit de retirer notre appui quand on pense que ce n'est pas nécessaire.
Donc, je comprends que pour le moment, vous jugez que c'est nécessaire. Quand ce ne sera pas nécessaire, vous allez retirer votre appui. Qu'est-ce qui va vous faire dire que ce n'est pas nécessaire? Donnez-moi un exemple concret qui va vous faire dire, moi, au NPD, je ne peux pas continuer de supporter ça.
Donc, il y a trois éléments de la menace qui continuent. Un, c'est le financement. Et on sait qu'il y a plusieurs personnes qui restent dans les banlieues d'Ottawa, les gens qui se cachent à Ottawa et sont prêts d'encore occuper la capitale si les mesures d'urgence sont enlevées. Donc, si les forces policières, si les sécurités peuvent nous dire que c'est réglé, les gens ne sont pas toujours dans les banlieues d'Ottawa ou ne sont pas toujours à Ottawa, propres dans la ville. Donc, ça, c'est un élément. Deuxièmement, c'est le financement. On sait qu'il y a un problème de financement. Beaucoup d'argent est élevé par ce groupe. On parle des millions de dollars, un niveau de levée de fonds seulement sur un site web, c'était presque 10 millions. Sur notre site web, c'était presque 5 millions. Donc, on parle de beaucoup d'argent. Donc, si c'est vérifié que la question de financement est réglée, ça, c'est une autre façon. Et finalement, on a vu qu'il y avait des essais de convois de retourner à Ottawa. Un convoi a été arrêté qui vient de Fort McMurray On a reçu des rapports qu'il y avait un autre essai d'arrêter ou de bloquer encore le pont ambassadeur. Donc, si ces essais sont arrêtés ou sont finis, donc ça, c'est un autre exemple de preuve qu'on attend. Pour nous, le but, c'est vraiment d'arrêter ce mouvement, d'arrêter la menace sur notre démocratie et primordial ou prioritaire, c'est vraiment le financement de ce mouvement.
Next question, Mia Robson with the Canadian Press.
Hi, yeah, I'm hoping you could just sort of go over that again a little bit in English and what you're like wanting to see from the federal government over the next week. What would sort of precipitate you deciding that you're going to pull your support?
Well, so some of the key elements of the threat right now, we know that there are people that are waiting in the surrounding areas of Ottawa to return back to Ottawa. So that can't be the case. They need to be cleared out. We know there are people that are still hiding in Ottawa itself. There are many people that are supportive of this occupation that are still in Ottawa. And so the idea that there are funds being frozen for those folks that are participating in the convoy that are waiting to return, if it's clear that they've been moved out and that they're no longer able to return, that would be something that would indicate no support's no longer needed. We know that the financing in general, this is a group that was able to raise significant amounts of funds. We know just on 2 websites alone that close to 10 million on one and 5 million on another. So these are significant amounts of funding that have funded this movement. And we know a large portion of that is foreign funding, particularly from the States. So we want to see that funding question has been addressed. We know there's been attempts made at numerous targets still, that bridges have been targeted, that there's been convoys that have been intercepted coming from different parts of Canada to Ottawa or to bridges. That's another area of concern. And also, when we talk about our continued support, we want to see a commitment from this government that this type of Emergencies Act doesn't apply to Canadians that are rightfully and legally raising their concerns. We're talking about workers fighting for fair conditions at work, or Indigenous community members raising concerns about their rights and their land rights, or environmental groups, or any Canadian, frankly, that's legally protesting. We want clear assurances that this type of measure is not used ever towards legal and rightful protests and those type of organizing efforts, which are legitimate. This is a case without precedent, and I want it to be very clearly expressed that this is an attack on our democracy. This is a group of folks who are very clearly connected with the extreme right wing. The organizers clearly had a goal in mind of undermining democracy, and that's something that we cannot allow to continue. And so those are some of the things that we want to see, commitments that in the future this never be applied and never be used as a precedent for those other circumstances, and that those elements of concern are, once they're addressed, we'll be prepared to withdraw our support.
I'm also curious, the Conservatives many times over the last few days of debate have accused the NDP of sort of breaking with your roots. They're talking about Tommy Douglas's opposition to using the War Measures Act in 1970. I'm just wondering what you say in response to that, but also how do you determine what's legitimate protest and what's not? How do you decide that this is not legitimate instead of it just being people saying things that you disagree with?
Well, we can start with the legitimate protest. The protests that we've seen when people are fighting decisions of government, when they're targeted towards a law, a legislation, a decision of government specifically, it's very different. And the efforts in those cases are very different. They're targeting government decisions. They're targeting a piece of legislation. That's very different from what we've seen in this occupation, which targeted people, which targeted residents, which targeted families and children trying to go to school. Like the focus of the attention of the occupation has been on people, and that's wrong. And that's from the outset. That was an illegal use of resources. What we also know when it comes to the difference between the Emergencies Act and the War Measures Act, there are vast differences. I spoke with Ed Broadbent, as you all know, a leader, and he was a member of Parliament when the War Measures Act, when the Emergencies Act was brought in, when he was instrumental in making sure that the new act was brought forward. And he himself said this is clearly different, a completely different scenario, that the Emergencies Act responded to the overly broad, serious concerns against the War Measures Act, and we voted against the War Measures Act because of its overly broad and dangerous use of powers. The Emergencies Act was a response to that, very different, very limited in scope, limited in duration, limited in power. It does not include the military whatsoever. So it's a very different scenario with a very different set of powers. It's something that having spoken with Ed Broadbent, something that he also supports as well. And something that we know that given this crisis, given the specific nature of it, these are specific powers to help us deal with this. It's very different.
Prochaine question, Hélène Bizetti, des Coop de l'information.
Oui, bonjour, M. Singh. Alors, je comprends que ce soir, les troupes du NPD vont appuyer le vote, vont voter en faveur du gouvernement. J'aimerais savoir dans quelle mesure la décision du gouvernement de faire du vote de ce soir un vote de confiance a pesé dans votre balance.
On a toujours reconnu que c'était un vote de confiance. Le fait que le gouvernement a invoqué la loi sur les mesures d'urgence, c'était toujours, dans notre avis, clairement une question de confiance, un vote de confiance. On a toujours su ça. C'était toujours dans notre pensée, dans notre réflexion. Mais notre décision était basée vraiment sur la menace. On pense que oui, il y a une menace et on doit régler cette menace. On a pensé que c'était important pour nous de montrer de leadership. Ce n'est pas un temps de jouer et de gagner des points politiques. C'était un moment de montrer de leadership, de régler cette crise. Et puis, il y a plusieurs choses sur lesquelles on doit travailler. Il y a plusieurs choses où on critique le gouvernement libéral. Et on continue de dire que c'était une faillite du gouvernement libéral, qu'on est dans cette situation. C'est clair, ils n'ont pas pris au sérieux la menace de ce convoi et de cette occupation. Donc, notre décision s'est basée sur la menace et sur l'importance de protéger les Canadiens et Canadiennes, les Québécois et Québécoises, l'importance de protéger notre démocratie. Et c'est pourquoi on va, avec réticence, appuyer le vote aujourd'hui.
Je pense que tu es sur sourdine, Hélène.
Oui, excusez-moi, ça avait été refermé. Excusez-moi. Alors, je change de sujet, M. Singh. Merci. Le maire Watson a suggéré que les camions saisis pendant la manifestation soient vendus pour que la ville se rembourse. J'aimerais savoir, avez-vous des indications que cela est permis par la loi et trouvez-vous que c'est une bonne idée? Que pensez-vous de cette idée, en fait?
Je pense que c'est je comprends la frustration, la frustration des gens que ces camions ont été utilisés pour menacer la population, pour harceler les gens depuis longtemps. Donc, je comprends la frustration. J'ai des inquiétudes avec l'application de la loi dans ce cas, le cas que vous avez soulevé. Et à ce moment, je n'ai pas vérifié si c'était un pouvoir inclus dans la loi sur la mesure d'urgence.
Prochaine question, Boris Proulx du Devoir.
Bonjour, M. Singh. Jeudi dernier, vous nous aviez dit que si la situation était terminée, vous n'appuieriez pas les mesures d'urgence. Et là, tout à l'heure, vous avez dit que les membres ou des sympathisants du convoi se cachent toujours dans les banlieues d'Ottawa. J'aimerais savoir quelles preuves vous avez de ça.
Les policiers ont dit qu'il y a des camions qui sont dans les banlieues, qui sont toujours là, ils ont bougé, ils ont demeuré de la ville d'Ottawa, mais ils sont toujours là. Donc, c'est quelque chose qui était déjà annoncé, qui est ouvertement disponible. Vous pouvez vérifier qu'il y a des camions et les policiers ont dit ça. Et ils ont aussi dit qu'il y a toujours des gens qui restent à Ottawa. Donc, la menace est toujours là.
Boris, je pense que c'est sur sourdine.
Pardon, merci. Concernant votre retrait possible de l'appui, si jamais les pouvoirs sont abusés, combien de temps ça prend pour vous de retirer votre appui dans le processus que vous avez mentionné? Si, par exemple, en comité, vous vous rendez compte que c'est plus nécessaire, ça prendrait combien de temps pour mettre fin aux mesures d'urgence?
Notre leader en chambre, notre House Leader, peut vous donner plus de détails, mais selon ce que j'ai vérifié avec la loi, le mécanisme qui existe, c'est si on soumet 20 signatures des députés, ça force un débat qui doit être pris en 3 jours, et puis le débat doit durer pas plus de 10 heures, et puis ça force une vote. Donc, ça nous donne un mécanisme assez rapide pour enlever ou retirer notre appui.
Next question, Catherine Lévesque with the National Post.
Yes, hi, Mr. Singh. Good afternoon. I wanted to know if you're going to allow a free vote within your caucus tonight, and if not, why?
I mentioned this before that our team is very reluctant. We've been reluctant since the beginning. All of us are. We consider this a very serious moment, and that using these powers is very serious. Given the real threat of the extreme right-wing organizers, the amount of funds that they have, we've taken a decision as a team. We will be supporting this reluctantly, and you'll see that that our team is going to support this, and we're supporting it because we understand how serious this is and the serious threat this poses to Canadians.
Okay, so my understanding is you're pretty confident all your MPs are going to be unanimous in voting for the continuation of this. And I just want to hear you on the confidence vote. You said in French that you weren't surprised that tonight was going to be a confidence vote, but given the seriousness of the situation, do you think it's appropriate right now that the Liberals are, in a way, playing political games and kind of pressuring you in a sense to and saying that this is a confidence vote and that if it does not pass, then the government goes into an election?
Well, I want to be clear on this point. We've always known that since the beginning that this was a confidence vote. I mean, if you compare the invocation of the Emergencies Act versus the throne speech, I mean, this is pretty serious. This is a very serious decision. So we've always known that. And we've based our decision based on how serious the crisis is, how seriously we take the threat of extreme right-wing organizers, and the threat of the amount of money that they have, and the threat to Canadians and our democracy. So we've always taken this very seriously. And our concern was that all levels of government failed to do so. They failed to take it seriously. And so our decision is based on the protection of Canadians. We've always known that this was an emergency vote, or this vote was a vote of confidence. That is something that we understood right away, that this would naturally be a vote of confidence. And we understood absolutely that we do not want to trigger an election. That would be the worst thing to do in this crisis, that this would somehow also trigger an election. We would never allow that to happen. That would never be acceptable in our opinion. But we know that this is serious, and we're making this decision based on the seriousness of the threat to Canadians and to our liberty, to our democracy. And we take that as something that requires, again, our reluctant, but our support.
Next question, Jacques Galland from the Toronto Star.
Hi, Mr. Singh. My first question is about, given the fact that you are supporting this and ensuring that it will pass in the House tonight, how can you be so confident that this act won't be invoked again, either by this government or any government in the future, to crack down on the circumstances that you mentioned earlier where Canadians are rightfully raising their concerns?
We share those concerns. Those are legitimate concerns. And we want to be really clear. This is a situation without precedent. And it should not be in any way be used to infer that. The government should lay out specifically that this was extreme right-wing groups that were seeking to undermine our democracy. That is a very unique scenario. That is not something that we've seen before. And that's not something that is replicated when communities are raising their voices legitimately to fight government decisions that they think are going to hurt their communities. And that's something that we want to support. And that should never be inferred by this scenario, which again, by its very nature, is very different. This is extreme right-wing organizers brazenly stating that their goal was to undermine democracy. They were clearly targeting and hurting residents. They were targeting families and people and small businesses. They were not targeting the government. It's very different from when we see legitimate protests that target government decisions, government policies, and when communities come together to do that. It's a very different scenario, and there is no way this should be used similarly. There will be court challenges, and those court challenges will test the criteria used. And that's an important tool also in our democracy of challenging or testing when an emergency act could be implemented. And I think that's an important part of our system that allows for a legal challenge and a legal test of the application of this law.
Thanks. And I'm wondering then, if you were Prime Minister, what would you have done? Would you have invoked the act, and would you have invoked it sooner?
Well, what we've said really clearly is, and what I've called on the Prime Minister a number of times, is as soon as this convoy made its intentions clear, they didn't hide the fact that they were coming to Ottawa. They didn't hide the fact that their memorandum of understanding clearly stated their intention to overthrow democracy. As soon as that was made clear, we would have taken it seriously. I would have taken it seriously as Prime Minister. I remember during the emergencies debate that which you called for, this was about 12, 13 days into the crisis, the occupation in Ottawa, the Prime Minister had not yet met with the mayor at that point in time. And it was only on the day of the emergency debate that that meeting actually happened. I would have never allowed for a crisis of that nature to happen in the capital of our country without meeting with the local municipal authorities and providing every resource possible to deal with it. I would never let it go 2 weeks to get to that point in the first place. And we've seen other cities that took it seriously, responded quickly, and were able to prevent any serious outcomes. Quebec City and Toronto, for example, were able to stop the convoy from getting out of hand. And so that's something that Ottawa and the Prime Minister and the provincial government, frankly, all failed to take into consideration how serious this was. The bridge as well was something that we saw very clearly. This was an attempt to, again, undermine our democracy and hurt workers and hurt jobs, and should never have been allowed to happen. The group is clear, their intentions were clear, and as soon as we saw any of these indications, as Prime Minister, I would have immediately responded and ended it before it got to the point that it's so serious now.
Prochaine question, Alexis Roy-Letarte du Journal Politique.
Bonjour, M. Singh.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. Dans les premiers jours des blocages à Ottawa, vous avez dénoncé un mouvement mené par des suprémacistes blancs. On peut comprendre que ça va dans une logique générale de montée de l'extrême droite au Canada. On peut voir ce mouvement-là partout dans le monde, en France, par exemple, avec Marine Le Pen et Éric Zemmour, une montée extraordinaire de l'extrême droite. Comment, selon vous, on prévient cette montée ici au Canada?
Je vous remercie infiniment pour la question parce que c'est une question vraiment importante pour notre pays et pour les gens. Donc, premièrement, on a une réponse directe. Quand on a des signes d'une sorte de mouvement comme ce qu'on a vu avec l'occupation à Ottawa ou ce qu'on voit, on doit réagir immédiatement. On doit agir et prendre au sérieux les menaces. Mais si on pense un peu sur la question et un peu plus profond, qu'est-ce qu'on doit faire pour arrêter la radicalisation en général? On sait que quand il y a des frustrations dans la vie des gens, quand les gens ont de la misère à rejoindre les deux bouts, de trouver du logement abordable, d'acheter l'épicerie, quand c'est difficile à vivre, quand c'est difficile dans la vie, ça crée un climat, les conditions pour la radicalisation. Donc, vraiment, la réponse à la radicalisation, c'est de mettre en œuvre des programmes sociaux, d'avoir des logements abordables, de créer des bons emplois, des bonnes opportunités, créer des conditions de vie où les gens peuvent réussir, les gens peuvent rejoindre les deux bouts et vivre avec la dignité. C'est vraiment où il n'y a pas de dignité, où il n'y a pas de respect pour les gens, où il n'y a pas de bonnes opportunités, que le climat est créé pour la radicalisation d'extrême droite. Donc, on doit enlever ces conditions. Et c'est pourquoi je me milite comme chef et notre parti toujours appuie des programmes sociaux, investissement dans nos soins de santé, investissement pour améliorer la vie des gens. C'est vraiment la seule façon, la seule façon de faire face à l'extrême droite.
Merci beaucoup, M. Singh. Maintenant, j'aimerais vous poser une question qui n'a pas rapport au conflit des camionneurs ici, mais qui n'est pas pour autant peu d'actualité. On parle du conflit en Ukraine, mais concernant l'objet de provocation de base du conflit, c'est-à-dire l'intention de l'OTAN, dont le Canada est fièrement membre, d'intégrer l'Ukraine dans son organisation en passant par l'intégration ukrainienne à l'Union européenne dans le but de respecter l'article 10 du traité de l'Atlantique Nord. J'aimerais savoir si oui ou non, vous appuyez l'intégration de l'Ukraine à l'OTAN, intégration potentielle dans le but des intérêts américains, raison à la base du conflit actuel. Merci.
Merci pour la question. C'est toujours la décision du pays de devenir membre d'un organisme. Donc, c'est toujours le droit de l'Ukraine de présenter cette question ou s'il veut arriver à cette conclusion, c'est leur droit de promouvoir leur position. Mais en général, je veux noter que notre position et ce qu'on exige le gouvernement de faire, c'est de régler les tensions, de réduire les tensions et de toujours trouver des façons diplomatiques d'utiliser les outils diplomatiques et de toujours encourager les pays pour régler la tension qui existe en Ukraine. Comme pays, le Canada a été le premier pays de reconnaître la souveraineté de l'Ukraine. On continue de reconnaître leur droit d'exister et on toujours reconnaître la crise qui existe maintenant et la menace qui existe. On encourage la diplomatie et une résolution des pays. Et c'est toujours le droit, l'autonomie des pays de décider s'ils veulent devenir membres d'une telle organisation. Et on va continuer de se militer pour la paix et pour la diplomatie de régler cette crise.
Next question, we have Ahmad Bayumi from News Beyond.
Hi, Mr. Singh. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Thanks for taking my question. I want to start off by asking you, how long do you foresee that the Emergencies Act will be invoked, or how long will it stay? And at what point, do you decide that it's no longer necessary? Do you rule out the possibility of, like you said, triggering a vote to, say that you don't have support for it before it ends or expires?
I appreciate the question. So I want to be clear. I don't think it's going to be necessary to run the full 30 days. And we are prepared to withdraw support before the full 30 days are run. So as legislation states, it's a 30-day Emergencies Act. We are prepared to withdraw that support before the conclusion of the 30 days. So that's where we stand. And the criteria will be if it's no longer necessary. And we're going to be pushing for up-to-date updates, clear and transparent presentation of the evidence that substantiates its continued use. We will be using the committee that is a part of the legislation that is required to be instated. This committee we want to see up and running immediately, and we will use the committee as one of the tools to ensure that we're getting up-to-date information about whether it's required or not. As soon as we feel it's no longer needed, as soon as a crisis has been dealt with, we will be withdrawing our support. We are reluctantly supporting the vote today in the interest of national unity, in the interest of protecting Canadians, and in the recognition of this real threat. But we will be, and we are prepared to, and we've already told the government that we are prepared to withdraw our support before the conclusion of the 30 days, as soon as it is no longer required.
Thank you. Alberta is filing a court challenge to what Premier Jason Kenney calls the unjustified use of the Emergencies Act. Other provinces have stated that they are not in support of the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Ontario is in a state of emergency declared by Premier Ford that basically makes it illegal to block highways and other critical infrastructure. So do you think that it is necessary to keep the Emergencies Act, a federal state of emergency in place when provinces are saying that they don't need it, and Ontario, which Ottawa is located in, has already a provincial state of emergency?
Appreciate the question. Well, in Ontario, the Premier did indicate that he supported the Emergencies Act. And in Alberta, I find it a bit rich that Premier Kenney requested help to deal with the Coots crisis himself, and now is criticizing the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So it's a little hypocritical of the Premier to one side say he needs help, and then when help comes to say that, oh, it's not needed. This is very limited in duration. The government has to continue to provide reasons why it's needed. As soon as it's clear to us that it's no longer needed, we will withdraw. One of the things, though, is absolutely clear is that there is national funding from across Canada that has gone towards this convoy, that has gone towards the occupation. And so having the ability to freeze accounts of those participating in the convoy, those that are organizers of this convoy, is essential. While I make that remark, I also know that there have been some concerns raised. If there's any concern about anyone who's inappropriately been impacted by the freezing of accounts, that is what this committee is there for. Those examples should be raised in committee and immediately addressed. No one should have their accounts frozen in any way that is not participating in or involved in the convoy. And we want to make sure that that is clear. The police are the ones that are making decisions around advising who is involved and freezing accounts. And so that should be done with great care, and our committee will be a part of the mechanism to ensure that it's been done appropriately to stop the convoy, to stop the organizers, and to stop the occupation and stop the threat to our democracy.
Just going to give a quick moment to see if there are any other raised hands. I think we're good. This concludes our press conference. Jagmeet, if you had any closing remarks.
Certainly. Thank you very much. I thank everybody for being here. Merci encore d'être ici. Je pense que c'est vraiment un moment important pour notre pays. C'est un moment sérieux et on prend au sérieux la décision de voter pour ces mesures. On le fait avec réticence et ce n'est pas un chèque en blanc. On est prêt de retirer notre appui si jamais le cas. This is a very serious moment for our country. We take this vote very seriously. We reluctantly will be supporting the Emergencies Act, but that's not a blank check. We were prepared to pull our support as soon as it's needed, as soon as the act is no longer needed. Thank you. Merci.